This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Juan Gonzalez for his first broadcast from his new home in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, Juan, I am sitting here with the New York City Council proclamation that was given to you on the last of your 3 lectures as you left New York, speaking on issues from immigration to harvest of empire, the stories of Latinos in the United States, talking about worker rights, and also talking about your 40 years as a journalist, many of those decades spent here in New York City. The New York City Proclamation cites all of your work and contributions to New York. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks, Amy. And it was great to see the terrific turnout at the last presentation I gave on December 12th. I saw a lot of old friends that I haven't seen in years.
And we will link to those stories, to those speeches that you gave at democracynow.org. Well, today we begin our segments looking at what's happening around the world when it comes to the climate crisis. More than 190 nations have agreed to protect at least 30% of the planet's land and oceans for wildlife by 2030. The agreement was reached in Montreal at the UN Biodiversity Summit known as COP15. The landmark agreement seeks to halt the Earth's 6th major mass extinction event, currently underway due to human activity. As part of the deal, Indigenous communities will have an increased role in protecting wildlife. Attendees at the summit included Helena Guailinga of the Sariaku community in the Ecuadorian Amazon.
We always talk about Indigenous people being 5% of the world's population and protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. So we are automatically, when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about Indigenous territories and Indigenous people.
Aisha Siddiqa from the tribal lands of Mochiwala in northern Pakistan said Indigenous knowledge is key to preserving biodiversity.
That knowledge comes from being part of that land. And you cannot just go in to a place like the Amazon rainforest or the Himalayan mountains and take samples of soil, take it back to your petri dishes, and over a few months come up with a solution. It's going to fail.
The United States did not participate in the formal drafting of the new agreement. That's because the U.S. and the Vatican are the only 2 countries in the world which have not signed on to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. We're joined now by 2 guests. Leila Salazar-Lopez is Executive Director of Amazon Watch, and Ariel Deranger is Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. She's a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, joining us from Edmonton, Canada. Ariel, let's begin with you. Can you talk about the significance of this COP15? Happened after the UN Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. Many people headed right to Montreal for this key meeting. What was accomplished and what wasn't?
So I think that there were some really, really good accomplishments at the CBD COP15, including many, many, many references to Indigenous rights. And I believe that there were over 20 references to Indigenous peoples, our rights, including free, prior, and informed consent. And just as the earlier segments just stated, it's absolutely impossible to create a biodiversity agreement without the inclusion of Indigenous rights, because 80% of remaining biodiversity is Indigenous lands and territories. So while we're seeing massive progress to recognize the rights on paper, some of the biggest challenges and risks that have come out of this COP is the fact that there aren't any real mechanisms with real teeth, similar to COP27, that actually protect our rights, our culture, and our ability to advance our rights to say yes and no to these types of agreements that are pushing forward not just sort of we're going to protect biodiversity, we're going to save the planet, but they're centering colonial economic ideals in the center. They're still giving national and colonial states the power to determine what Indigenous rights look like when they're implemented in these agreements and how lands will be developed, undeveloped, protected, so on and so forth. There's a lot of really flowery language, but there still lacks any real substantive ways for Indigenous peoples to be leaders in this movement like they claim that they are hoping to advance.
And Ariel, could you talk about the significance of COP15 being co-hosted by China and Canada, two of the biggest polluters in the world and nations that still promote extractive industry and fossil fuels?
I mean, both of these countries have a really big interest in being leaders, or at least the optics of being leaders in advancing biodiversity safeguarding because of that, because of the fact that they are massive leaders in creating emissions on the planet. My community, Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, is downstream from one of the largest industrial projects on planet Earth, the Alberta tar sands, and we're also within a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is being degraded ongoing every single year, to the point that my community attended this COP to sort of highlight how this park continues to be degraded by industrial development. So countries like Canada and China have a vested interest in appearing as though they are leading the way. In fact, there are reports that Canada is leading the way, that China is advancing technologies to help us meet these commitments. Yet the reality is they're creating these optics and diversion tactics so that they can continue business as usual. In Canada, where I come from, I can speak to this directly, where we are committing to 30 by 30, millions and millions of dollars for biodiversity protection, Indigenous protection, and conservation areas, yet we are not talking about ending the expansion of the Alberta tar sands. We are not talking about ending the destruction to biodiversity in other areas. We're creating the optics of sacrifice zones so we can choose which areas to save, which areas to diminish, and this results in human rights abuses, Indigenous rights abuses, and the risking the planetary health for everyone.
I'd like to bring in Leila Salazar Lopez, Executive Director of Amazon Watch. Leila, from your perspective, what are some of the victories and what's missing from this agreement, and how would some of the key aspects be implemented, from what you can tell?
Yes, good morning, Juan and Amy. So glad to be on the show with you all today. And there's a lot to reflect on about this COP 15. And as Ariel already mentioned, this is something that we're on one side looking at as, yes, it's good that there's an agreement. I think there's a lot of comparisons to the Paris Climate Agreement. This agreement is to climate similar to how we were looking at how we see the Paris Climate Agreement to biodiversity. When we think of what's really happening on our Mother Earth, when we think of the climate crisis, when we think of the mass extinction crisis that we're facing as humanity on Mother Earth, we are in multiple crises, and I don't need to name them all, but this is in advance, yes. And as Ariel mentioned, it mentions and acknowledges Indigenous peoples, and that is an advance in comparison to what we would see in past years. And it is better than nothing. It is a framework. We're looking at this as a framework for biodiversity and how we can move forward to avoid further extinction and further harm to biodiversity. Yet, there's still a long way to go. The aim, if we look at Target 3, the aim is 30 by 30. That means protecting 30% of land, water, and resources by 2030. And that is what the majority, that is what the agreement calls for. One of the key elements of the agreement. However, there are others that we're calling for 50 by 2030. So this is an advance, but there's still a long way to go. There's still a long way to go. When I think of the Amazon rainforest and the threats to the Amazon rainforest is already at a tipping point. It's at a tipping point, and so that's the tipping point of ecological collapse in parts of the Amazon because of the deforestation and the degradation caused by many of the threats that Ariel was mentioning, including oil extraction, fossil fuel extraction, and mining. And so Indigenous peoples, together with scientists and academics and activists and NGO organizations like Amazon Watch, we are calling for much beyond 30 by 30 or even 50 by 30. We're calling for 80 by 2025. And yes, that is ambitious. And it's very ambitious. But what we're calling for is a commitment to a permanent protection of the Amazon rainforest by 2025. And we didn't get that, but we definitely advanced that call and the urgency of protecting the Amazon from global threats like industrial mining from countries like Canada.
You name some names, Leila. Talk about the corporations that have caused the most harm in the Amazon and the private investors promoting open pit mines, mega dams, and so forth, like Canada's Belo Sun plans for the massive open pit gold mine in the Volta Grande region of the Brazilian Amazon. Their stock taking a major hit while COP15 was taking place in Montreal. What do you attribute this to?
Thanks for that question, Amy. Yes, many of you may remember the Belo Monte Dam fight. This is the biggest dam in the middle of the Amazon rainforest on the Xingu River. In the midst of that fight 12 years ago, many of our allies, Indigenous peoples on the ground, the Brazilian civil society, said, this dam, remember, this dam is not for energy, it's for mining. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing that Belo Sun, and from back then, Belo Sun was already eyeing the Xingu region to develop this massive gold mine. So Belo Sun is a Canadian mining company, and it has plans to build the largest open pit gold mine in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon near the Belo Monte Dam and the homelands of Indigenous peoples who are already threatened by this mega dam, already threatened by cattle grazing, by agribusiness, by land grabbing. So Belo Sun is a major culprit, and they are financed by the Royal Bank of Canada. And so one of the things that we did as an ally to Indigenous peoples and working to protect and defend the Amazon in solidarity with Indigenous peoples is we supported a delegation of Indigenous peoples from the Brazilian Amazon and other parts of the Amazon to call out Belo Sun in Canada. This was an opportunity because on the ground, they are not consulting Indigenous peoples. They are moving forward with their plans with the permission of the Brazilian government to build the largest open pit gold mine. And so we went there to call out Belo Sun. We released a report, the investment risks of Belo Sun, and held events and also held actions outside of banks like the Royal Bank of Canada. And just last week, the stock price of this company tanked. And go ahead.
We're going to be wrapping, and I wanted to ask Ariel, as you talk about what's happening in Canada, the lack of participation by the U.S. and the Vatican, what it means that it did not participate in the COP15 agreement, didn't join the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And do you think its lack of involvement may have been what led to it being less watered down profound than, for example, what happened in Paris, the well-known COP climate agreement.
Absolutely. I think without these key players being the Vatican, the origin of the colonial empire with the ideology of man's dominion over nature not being there, and the United States, which has a deep history of their conservation movement, including the displacement, invisibilization, and devaluing and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, not being there absolutely is not a surprise. Let's just get that out of the way. It's not surprising that they didn't see this as a priority. And secondarily, this is why we led to some really strong language. The concern, though, with the languages that came out of this is that it's still up to the states. It still centers the economy, which is something that the United States and the Vatican are still going to applaud. And it still puts our communities, our lands and territories at risk for the ongoing colonial conservation movement that sees us as just someone to be consulted. We have consent throughout this document, but we all know that when it comes down to the states, it doesn't matter what kind of language we have in these international agreements if the states are still leading the way. We're going to still see the destruction of the Amazon, the destruction of the boreal forest. UNESCO World Heritage has been in place for over 100 years. It's this anniversary where my community lives, and my community is saying, stop giving the government this money. Give it to us. Let us protect the caribou. Let us protect the lands and the water. For us, conservation and biodiversity management means land back. It means taking it out of hands like the Vatican and colonial empires that have created genocide for our communities.
Ariel's Equi Deranger of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation speaking to us from Edmonton, Canada. She's Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. And Leila Salazar-Lopez, Executive Director of Amazon Watch. Thanks so much for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to cover the issue of the climate crisis. And if people want to go to our website at democracynow.org, you'll see our complete coverage of the UN Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, that just concluded as well.